Hello again, this is Steve Ellis at Quest Ministries, here to tackle again one of those tough questions that people like to ask to Christians about the Bible, about any kind of tough area. In a previous session, we talked about the inspiration of the Bible. How do we even know that the Bible was inspired of God? But today we tackle a little different question, and that is, even though it might have come from God, it might have been written down in the original language the way it was supposed to, but there's been copying, right? Man had to get involved. Man had to do some preserving of those documents because the original materials they use get worn out over time. You can't tell me, some people would say, that over these centuries, man hasn't added to or taken away or corrupted the original. Doesn't man have agendas? Haven't there been political or spiritual movements that would have caused people to rewrite the Bible to their own suitable preferences? That's the question we're going to tackle today. So even if we could make a case for inspiration, when it was first written down in what we call the autograph, the original, man had to copy. Man had to put those into other documents as the original materials began to decay. What kind of case do you make for accurate copying? That's what we talk about when we talk about reliable. Well, fortunately, there is a test that's applied to every other ancient book that we look at. The ancient writers like Plato and Aristotle, those guys. How do we know that their books are reliable? Well, there's a threefold test that we use. One's called the bibliographic test, that actually has three sub-tests involved. We'll look at that for the Bible. There's also the internal test and something we call the external test. We'll unpack those in just a moment. But let's take a look first at this bibliographic test. See, the idea here begins with, okay, there was something written down originally called the autograph, but then it had to be copied. Partly because, as we've said, those materials from the original began to decay. They weren't going to last forever. They weren't like some of the materials we have in the modern world. So in the copying, we produce what's called a manuscript. And to be fair, a copy of a copy is also called a manuscript. So is there any way you can subject manuscripts to a test to see if, in fact, they are reliable? Well, what if you had two manuscripts? That would be good, because then you could compare or contrast those two manuscripts to see if they have common material. Are there gaps? What manuscript was written before the other? Can we know that with any certainty? And does that give any credibility to a reliable manuscript? Well, what if you had three or four or five? What if you had all that many? You could compare and contrast those manuscripts to see what they had in common and what was missing. Well, here's another scenario. What if we had this autograph copied into a manuscript and another manuscript and another manuscript, and we had not only 6 or 7 or 10 or 20 or 50 or 100, what if we had thousands of manuscripts to compare and contrast and see where there's commonality and where there's textual variance, a technical term that textual critics like to use? That would really be helpful. The more we would have, the better we could compare and contrast. And this happens to be the first of the three tests in the bibliographic test. What is the quantity of the manuscripts that we have? And you subject this to any kind of ancient book that we currently have. Obviously, more is better. So when we look at the writings of ancient guys like Plato and Aristotle, Caesar, Tacitus, which we're going to focus on in a moment as a good example, you look at these guys and you'll find that they have a pretty good number. They have about 20 manuscripts at most in some of these, some fewer. But how would that compare to, say, the Old and New Testament? Well, for the New Testament, the number is staggering. We have over 5,700 manuscripts in the Greek. We have over 10,000 in Latin and another 9,300 in other languages to make a grand total of nearly 25,000 manuscripts. Now, when I say manuscript, I'm not talking about a complete copy of, say, the New Testament. In many cases, it's a complete book, but sometimes it's just partial pages. Sometimes it's just a fragment. But any copy in any form of the original or a copy of a copy is determined to be a manuscript. But look at the numbers. They're absolutely staggering. 25,000 in comparison with only 20 of ancient writers. So if we look at that in a chart, we'll see that one guy, Homer, writing ancient books, one being the Iliad, has a pretty good number by comparison. He has the most of any other ancient book beyond the Bible. He has over 643 copies. Please also note the date that we think he wrote, around 800 BC, and then the earliest copies that we have, the older manuscripts, there's a time gap of about 400 years. Keep that in mind. But when you look at other writers like Plato and Caesar and Tacitus and their ancient writings, that number drops down to an abysmal 20 copies when compared with the New Testament, where there's nearly 5,700 manuscripts just in the Greek alone. And the time gap is not 1,000 years. The time gap is, in some cases, 50 to 100 years. If you look at the entire list of what we currently have in manuscripts for the New Testament, you'll see that number again of the Greek, but there's also 10,000 Latin, Ethiopic, Slavic, Armenian, and other ones that bring us to a total of nearly 25,000. And there's already, in the last few years, discoveries of more manuscripts that are under evaluation. It's unbelievable the difference in those numbers. Remember, we talked about Tacitus. Most of you who study history will know Tacitus is our definitive work on the Roman history. We look at his annals, his history book that Tacitus wrote, covering the reign of 4 Roman emperors succeeding to Caesar Augustus. The parts of the works that survive from antiquity cover most of the reigns of Tiberius and Nero. If you believe in Roman history as accurate, you rely upon the work of Tacitus. But what did he really write? We know that he wrote 16 books, 16 volumes that cover the entire reign of Roman history as he knew it. But here's the sad part. Of those 16 books, volumes 7, 8, 9, and 10 are completely missing. We don't even have them. We don't even have references to them with any accuracy at all. And then there are parts of volume 5, 6, 11, and 16 they're just missing. They're not even a complete volume. So what we have of the first half of the annals is all survived, those remnants and those complete volumes of the first 8 books, in only one single manuscript, just one. And the same is true of the second half of those 16 volumes. Those have only survived in one single manuscript. And yet, no one questions the authenticity, no one questions the historicity or reliability of Roman history as reported by Tacitus. The point is, if we're going to accept that, and we look at those paltry number of manuscripts, we have to look at the New Testament and explain them as being the most reliable by comparison. There's a second part of the bibliographic test that involves the quality of those manuscripts. Quality as recorded in terms of precision. What kind of care did scribes and copiers of biblical material take when they put that next copy down in writing? Well, it's amazing how the rules and the history of scribes have been preserved through the ages so that we know what kind of care that they exercise. It is unparalleled in terms of copying because they did consider these books ancient historical renderings of the Most High God. And you can find some of these rules for copying, especially in the Old Testament. They're absolutely amazing. For example, it said that they could only copy on the skins of clean animals, kosher animals. The skin was lined off with a certain number of lines and columns so that it would be equal spacing for reading. Even the type of ink was prepared for specifically the Bible recordings, and it had to be always black as they wrote on white materials. And nothing, absolutely nothing could be done from memory. Nothing could be done from memory. They couldn't remember a phrase or a line or a word or even a letter without comparing. I found it interesting that one of the rules that scribes had to observe, just so they would focus and never leave their work, said this: should a king address the scribe while he's working, he must take no notice of him. He couldn't even look up to acknowledge royalty. So in this copying set of rules, each letter of the scroll had to be visually confirmed one by one with the master scroll, the one that they already knew was accurate. And if the work, once completed, which took forever to do, as you would imagine, It was checked for accuracy. And if it were found to be accurate, the scribe and the copy were celebrated. And much to our chagrin, I guess, we think we should preserve everything. Once the accuracy was checked and the new scroll was found to be accurate, they would destroy the earlier scroll because they knew ultimately it would deteriorate anyway. They had such confidence in the new copy. But what if in this quality control check they found a mistake? Well, first of all, how would they find a mistake? Well, obviously, if they had the original and accurate copies following, they would have a master scroll. And so each letter of each scroll was counted. And they knew the count compared to the master scroll. Each word in each scroll was counted, and that count was compared to the master scroll. And so they would obviously know if, say, an ancient book had 5,000 letters, they could divide that number by 2, and they would come up with what would be conceivably the middle letter of a book. And so they would go look at the copy, they would check and find what is the middle letter in that scribe's work, and they would compare that to the master scroll. And guess what? If they found that the letter was off by just one letter, they would deem the new copy void and inaccurate, unreliable. They would destroy this scribe's long-term work. They would tear it up and say, go back and do it all over again. The copying would be restarted. That's the kind of quality control that they exercised. Well, how do you know that this quality was maintained? Is there any way to even test that? Well, fortunately, we do have a test historically. You've probably heard of the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, 1947. If we look at a timeline comparing that with the time of Christ, we will go back and say prior to 1947, which was when the Dead Sea Scrolls were found, we had an Old Testament book of Isaiah, but it did not date to the time before Christ. It dated to 916 AD. Well, why is that significant? Well, as you perhaps know about the book of Isaiah, there's a lot of prophecy about the coming Messiah, a lot of fulfillment of prophecy to go toward Jesus Christ of Nazareth. And Isaiah 52, 53, 54 are amazingly accurate when they describe what was going to happen at the crucifixion. In fact, the details in Isaiah 53 are so incredibly exact. They're even more detailed than the eyewitness accounts when that actually occurred in the first century. And since the oldest copy we had prior to the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls in 1947 dated after the time of Christ by almost 900 years, it led many scholars to come up with the idea that the book of Isaiah had been added to. That someone, knowing what had happened at the cross, went back and added Isaiah 52, 53, 54, maybe parts of that, having observed or known of the exact details of the cross, and therefore could punch up the story a little bit by saying it was prophesied. And that was the prevailing view by many people prior to 1947. But in that year, a little shepherd boy trying to find a lost sheep that he thought might have wandered into one of these caves in the Qumran community, somewhere around the Dead Sea, went about trying to find that sheep, started throwing rocks up into the openings of some of these cliff caves to see if he would rustle his sheep up. And instead of hearing a sheep, his rock entering this opening, this particular one, he heard a crash of clay pots. And upon scurrying up into the cave, he discovered there was no sheep there, but there was a bunch of clay pots that had all these documents and scrolls and a number of things that this Qumran community had preserved centuries before when the Roman armies were invading, and they didn't want the Roman armies to get all their sacred documents. And so that began a search throughout all the caves and caverns around this area, and many, many places were discovered to have all these clay pots and all of these documents, many of which were biblical writings. And in the midst of all those discoveries, they found a complete copy of the book of Isaiah that not only dated before the time of Christ, it dated 125 years before the time of Christ, not all the way back to the original writing centuries before when Isaiah first wrote it. But this didn't matter. We now have a gap filled of almost 1,000 years from the previously oldest copy of Isaiah to one before the time of Christ. So now we can test and see, did they observe these scribal quality control rules and maintain the the reliability of the document. And were these prophecies in this oldest copy of 1947 predating the time of Christ? How do these two manuscripts compare? Well, you're looking at a picture of the actual document that is in possession of the Dead Sea Scrolls Society, and they compared, especially chapter 53, some of those exact, very descriptive words of the cross, and here's what they found. In just one chapter, Isaiah 53, which contains 166 words, in over 1,000 years of copying, there's only one word, 3 letters in question after 1,000 years of transmission. And these words, these 3 letters, this does not significantly change the meaning of the passage. Can you grip the incredible enormity of that find? 1,000 years of copying over and over again, and all they can find is the addition of 3 letters making one small word that absolutely does not change the meaning. This is the quality control that our scribes observed to make sure we would have reliable documents to this day. So a third and final test of the bibliographic test involves the time span. As we've already noted, if there's a long gap between the original writing, the autograph, and the oldest manuscript we have, we are concerned there would be enough time for errors to creep in. So shorter is better when it comes to time span. The average gap between the original writing and oldest copy we possess of ancient writers is about 1,000 years. But when you compare that to the New Testament, the average gap is only about 200 years, and in some cases 100 years or less. It's amazing how the difference of these two comparisons, ancient writers versus the Bible, always bring the Bible into a higher reliability factor than any other ancient book. And yet some people will doubt its reliability. So when you look at the threefold test of the bibliographic test, the quantity, the quality, and the time span between them, you will find that the Bible passes those tests better than any ancient book. Again, looking at our chart, you'll see in every area there is no comparison. The point here is if we're going to accept writers like Tacitus as being reliable in how they report Roman history, or any other writer in the ancient times as to what they report, we are compelled to accept writings of the Old and New Testament as being that much more reliable. What about the other tests? In addition to the bibliographic test, we have what's called the internal test. This is an interesting one because basically the internal test says, what does the document, what does the ancient writing claim about itself? Does it even claim to be reliable? Does it claim to have come from reliable sources? Does it claim to come from eyewitness accounts? In the case of the Bible, we see that. For example, in the writing of 1 John, John writes that which was from the beginning, which we have heard, which we have seen with our eyes, which we have looked upon and our hands have handled of the word of life. That which we've seen and heard declare we unto you. In other words, we were there. We were the eyewitnesses of the accounts that we report. We didn't hear them second, third hand. One might say that's a circular argument. The thing is reliable because it says it's reliable. It says it's eyewitness accounts. The point is, we need that document to make that claim. It will not stand alone on that test. But if it doesn't make that claim, if it says, well, we just sort of heard these things secondhand, we would have to doubt the reliability of that book. The third test, which is amazing, is called the external test. Now we go outside the writings of the book in question and ask, are there other writings, are there other ways to test to see if things referred to within that document are confirmed? Are there extra-biblical sources, to use the big seminary word? Are there scientific confirmations? Are there other historical documents that report the exact same thing? And the good news is with something reliable, you'll always find that. There are other outside sources, whether they be Greek or Roman or Latin, that report some of the same facts and histories and governments and historical events that we find in the New Testament and in the Old Testament. In fact, you'll find in many non-sympathetic sources that have no agenda to prove the Bible, are actually confirming the events of the Bible. Let me give you one example. The ancient historian of Jewish history, Josephus, writes in his Antiquities of the Jews, chapter 3, this account of Jesus. He says in chapter 3, "Now there was about this time Jesus, a wise man, if it be lawful to call him a man, for he was a doer of wonderful works, a teacher of such men as received the truth with pleasure. He drew over to him both many of the Jews and many of the Gentiles. He was the Christ. And when Pilate, at the suggestion of the principal men among us, had condemned him to the cross, though that loved him at the first did not forsake him, for he appeared to them alive again the third day. And as the divine prophets had foretold these and 10,000 other wonderful things concerning him, and the tribe of Christians so named from him are not extinct at this very day." So there's an external source confirming the actual accounts of the Bible. There's other external tests, including the science of archaeology. Since a book like the Bible is locked into history and culture and civilizations and geographic locations, archaeologists can go in that region, dig down deep enough, and find or not find things that would confirm the Bible. And what's amazing is archaeology, though it's not set up to prove the Bible, every incredible find in archaeology in the ancient world where the Bible was written and lived out, there's never been an archaeological find to disprove anything in the Bible. If anything, it has been proving and proving and proving things that were written about in the Bible. Let me give you an example. I happened to go to Israel some years ago, and I'd heard the account that when they unearthed the ancient walls of Jericho, they were amazed at what they found to confirm the Bible. Those of you who read the Old Testament will know that Jericho was one of those cities of the children of Israel. As they made their entrance into the Promised Land, they had to overcome this walled city. It was a fortified city, very hard to overcome. And God told his people, don't you fight them militarily. Don't exert force on this walled city. He would bring the walls down himself. And they marched around the city, you recall. They shouted, they blew trumpets, and the wall came down, and they went in and conquered the city. Well, when archaeologists finally got to the location and unearthed this ancient city, they were amazed at what they found because, yes, they found the walls on a slant and moving downward and falling over. And I don't know if you can actually see it in this actual picture I took, but these walls were falling in a certain direction that confirmed the supernatural. The Bible doesn't say this, but what they found confirmed that it had to be a supernatural event. Well, let me ask you, how would that be confirmed? Well, if a military force comes against a walled city and exerts force upon the wall, which way is the wall going to fall? Well, certainly they're not going to go up and pull a wall outward onto themselves. That would kill the army trying to make that wall fall. Their military force would push the wall inward. What you find when you dig up the city of Jericho, the archaeologists found, is the walls literally fell outward. And the only way that could occur would be if a supernatural force pushed them outward as this army was trying to enter the city. Amazing confirmation from archaeology. So the conclusion by some is this: the evidence for our New Testament writing is ever so much greater than the evidence for many writings of classical authors, and the authenticity of which no one dreams of questioning. So if the New Testament were a collection of secular writings, their authenticity would generally be regarded as beyond all doubt. Friends, the point is, if you look at the Old and New Testaments of our Bible and subject them to the same exact tests that they subject to every ancient book, this Bible passes the bibliographic, the internal, and the external tests like no other ancient book. You can't find a more reliable document in all of history. So we've made our case for inspiration. We've also made our case for the historical, reliable copying of the manuscripts. You will not find something any more reliable than the Bible.